Welcome, everyone. This is our Middle Housing information session where we're going to talk about the Planning Commission's recommendation with you all. This is our second information session. It's February 22nd, and in just a moment, we'll go through introductions and ground rules for the meeting, and then we'll launch into our presentation, followed by question and answers. So I'm Terry Harding. I'm the principal planner for the city's community planning and design team. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also the project manager for the city's Middle Housing Code Amendments project. And also here today are Sophie and Jeff, and also a planning commissioner. So I'll have you each introduce yourselves briefly. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Sophie McGinley. I'm an associate planner with community planning and design. I use she, her pronouns, and I've been public engagement lead for this project. I'll pass it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Sophie. My name is Jeff Kepper. I'm a senior planner with the land use planning team, and I'm here as the code expert lead for the project. And with that, I will pass it over to Commissioner Fragola.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending this information session. My name is Lisa Fragola. I'm a member of the City of Eugene Planning Commission, and I use she, her, they pronouns.
Thank you, Lisa. The other item on this slide is an email address, and this is where the public is invited to submit their comments about the Middle Housing Code Amendments. The email address is middlehousingtestimony@eugene-or.gov. And throughout the meeting, we'll be dropping links into the chat, as well as having you put your questions there. So you don't have to write that down right now. We'll provide it to you a couple more times. Next slide, please. For this meeting, we ask everyone to abide by these shared agreements. First, keep yourself on mute until you are called upon. Second, put questions in the chat, and a staff person will moderate those questions during the Q&A. Third, only one person speaks at a time. Number 4, please use respectful language. 5, please keep your questions to 1 minute if you are unmuted and asking a verbal question. And number 6, save your comments for the public hearing. And we'll talk about this one more, but in general, the point of this information session is to provide information and hear questions. And the time for public comments is both the email address and the council's public hearing, which is scheduled for April 18th. Next slide. So my portion of this presentation is a little bit of background about the Middle Housing Code Amendments project. And it starts with a House bill in the Oregon legislature from 2019. It's House Bill 2001, which was introduced by Speaker Kotek. At the time, she was the speaker. The bill proposed to eliminate the type of zoning that only allows single-family homes on lots throughout Oregon. It was referred to as the Middle Housing Bill and has a deadline of implementation for cities in Oregon of June 30th, 2022. Throughout the process, the state adopted minimum standards for cities to comply with and a model code. And we'll go into some more detail about that in just a minute. But first, what is middle housing? This slide shows a common graphic that pops up around the internet and in various books. It's from Opticos Design, and it shows missing middle housing as being between single family homes and larger apartment buildings. So it's everything from duplexes to fourplexes, clustered housing, multiplexes, and live work. But in Eugene and under the Oregon bill, next slide, this is what's defined as middle housing for Oregon. A duplex, which is 2 units, a triplex, which is 3, a fourplex, which is 4, a cottage cluster, which is a grouping of no fewer than 4 detached dwellings per acre with a footprint of no greater than 900 square feet. And that includes a common courtyard. So those are pretty small homes clustered around some common open space. And lastly, townhouses, which are 2 or more attached dwellings where each dwelling is located on its own lot and shares at least one common wall with an adjacent dwelling. Over the past 2 years, the state has directed some rulemaking to help cities implement the new law. It's been overseen by the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which put together a Rules Advisory Committee, or a RAC, and a Technical Advisory Committee, or a TAC, to advise on the rules and the model code. And these included members from around the state of Oregon, from a variety of cities, organizations, and interest groups. At the end, they made recommendations on what minimum standards to adopt, what should be in the model code, and then those documents were adopted formally by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. Locally, for the city of Eugene to implement this House bill, we created some project goals. And here they are. We've gone over them at every meeting with the public and the Planning Commission thus far. The first goal is to comply with the House bill and survive legal challenges. The second goal is to further long-standing goals in our community for housing equity and affordability. And thirdly, to enable housing availability or production and diversity of type. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sophie, who's going to talk a little bit more about our public involvement process.
Thank you, Terry. So the public involvement process kicked off with the approval of a public involvement plan in summer of 2020. The public involvement plan was approved by the Planning Commission. It included several components. Some are listed here. So we had some stakeholder roundtables. We tried some new things like having a lottery selected panel and an equity roundtable. We compensated some participants. We launched a community-wide survey. We worked with some University of Oregon students. We started an Instagram, made a Reddit presence, and then have had all of our usual public hearings and public meetings, such as the Planning Commission meetings. Everything has been throughout COVID, so it's been online. So if you're really interested in learning more about the public involvement process or even watching a few meetings, I invite you to go to eugene-or.gov/middlehousing, and you will find all of the meeting recordings and materials and more information about our public involvement process linked there. And that includes this nifty infographic that you probably cannot read all at once over Zoom, but this just shows a little bit of who we heard from and how we heard from them. So after we did our initial phase of public involvement, the results of that was these 8 guiding values and principles for how we were to approach the rest of the project. And one of those guiding values and principles was to go beyond the minimum standards established by House Bill 2001. And so staff came up with 3 ways that we could comply. The first is allow, which means to meet the minimum standards. The second is encourage, which means exceeding the minimum standards to remove some barriers to middle housing. And the third is incentivize, which is exceed some of the minimum standards specifically to lower the cost of middle housing. And we'll go more into these details shortly. So we have a summary of the Planning Commission recommendation. So the Planning Commission made their recommendation for the middle housing project not too long ago, and we decided to summarize what they recommended. So this guide to the Planning Commission recommendation is on the project webpage. It includes a lot of background information, a letter from the Planning Commission to City Council, a code summary, and then some summaries of our incentives. And so first I will walk through the code summary tables. So Terry talked about the minimum standards in the model code. And so we can start with that. This is an example page out of the code summary tables. The far left column is the minimum standards. And so this is the minimum that all cities, this applies equally to all large cities in Oregon, the minimum that large cities have to do to comply with the bill. And then the middle column is the model code, and the model code meets the minimum standards and is an example of how to meet them, but differs from them and exceeds them in some cases. And so we have that there. The reason the model code is important, other than showing an example of how to comply with the House bill, is that if we don't adopt our House Bill 2001 middle housing code standards by June 30th of this year, then the model code will apply. And then the far right column is the Planning Commission recommendation. So that has the Planning Commission's proposed standards. And then there's these colored labels. And so if there's allow, which is kind of a orangey yellow, that means that the Planning Commission recommendation matches that far left column, the minimum standards. If it's green with encourage, that means that it exceeds it. And then if it's incentivize, which is blue, that means that there are specific incentives for affordability or transit-oriented development in that standard. Oh, and I had red boxes to walk you through that I forgot to slide through. Here they are. So in general, a lot of the proposed code actually does just meet the minimum standards. And so some cases of that are frontage, lot width, setbacks, parking, and design standards. Other cases where we encourage is lot size, lot width, height, and lot coverage. So we'll go through that a little bit. And then generally there are three main incentives, which is to allow detached middle housing, allow for smaller lot sizes, and then allow for a reduction of on-site parking requirements. So first we can go through building height. And so really the main difference with the encouraged standard of height is that the Planning Commission is proposing to allow an additional 5 feet for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhouses. And this really is to ensure that those plexes can be built with a third story in a feasible way. But we have been hearing a lot of questions about height and what height means. And so I have a quick quiz for everyone. So this is an example of possible middle housing. Let me launch my poll. So I want to ask you all, where is height measured? And the choices are A or B. A is that middle top part, and B is the tallest point of the building on this side. So I'm going to let those answers roll in, and after I let them roll in, I will share the answers. I guess this is a fun part of Zoom, is that we get to do polls like this. Okay, so I'll share. It looks like most folks picked A. And actually, that is not the case. Building height generally is measured at B. And so how can we possibly get to A? Well, an additional 7 feet of height is allowed for slopes that are 6 over 12. And so when we see that additional 7 feet, for example, we've heard some folks talking about middle housing as being allowed to reach 42 feet. That would just mean that the developer of the middle housing would be using that additional 7 feet with that slope. This standard currently applies to single detached dwellings. And so even though the maximum height for single detached dwellings is 30 feet, folks can build those up to 37 feet if they meet the standards. Okay, I have another fun poll for everyone. This is a maximum build out scenario made by our urban designer, Jen, who I believe is on the call today. And I want to ask you all, which houses are fourplexes? And there's a bit of a clue already, because houses is plural. So I'll let you all know that there's 2, and you get to pick multiple answers. So I have that poll launched. Which houses are fourplexes? Great, seeing some answers come in. We'll give that just 10 or so more seconds. Okay, So it looks like we have some mixed results. I'll share those now. So it looks like people are pretty sure that B is a fourplex. We have some for A, some for C, and some for D. So let's see which ones they are. So the fourplexes are actually B and D. And B is the maximum build out using the Planning Commission's recommended code. If the fourplex also uses parking, on-site parking reduction. D is the maximum build out if the fourplex is required to add 4 parking spaces. So we can see that from a few angles. I'll also note that A is a maximum build out for what's currently allowed in the code for single detached dwellings. And so here you can see that the max build out of A and B are actually quite similar, even though they're a single detached dwelling and a fourplex. And that's because middle housing really is designed to fit into our current neighborhood fabric. C is a make-believe house. That one is just, supposed to be just a modest existing single detached dwelling, in line with what we see around neighborhoods these days. Here's a rear view. So this really shows how much space maximum parking or maximum on-site parking can take up. So you see D is the maximum build out of the fourplex with parking. B is the maximum build out without parking. And then you can see that A is the max build out of single detached with 1 parking spot that's in the front. Okay, so going beyond the minimum standards, as I've already said, most of the proposed code meets the minimum standards. It's that allow option. Where it differs, it does so to incentivize smaller housing types, lower cost housing, income qualified housing, transit oriented development, and flexibility for already developed sites. And we're not alone. We've been tracking how other cities have been complying with the bill. And these are just some of the names that we're aware of, but Albany, Bend, Gresham, Milwaukee, Newburgh, Portland, Salem, and Springfield are also proposing that some of their standards exceed the minimum standards. So every city is finding a way that works for them to comply with the bill. And lastly, we expect these code amendments to result in slow incremental change and infill. So some highlights of the Planning Commission's recommendations for the incentives are that detached housing would be allowed. There's incentives for smaller housing, housing near transit, and affordable housing. And I'll walk through those now. So the minimum standards allow for cities to choose whether middle housing can be detached as well as attached. I think usually when we think of a fourplex, we think of one big building, but that's actually not how it's always been. So here's an example of an older fourplex that's already in Eugene. It's on Patterson Alley, and it's a detached fourplex. So it's just 4 houses on 1 lot, but defined as a fourplex. And we're hoping that this allows for some design flexibility and discourages displacing existing houses. So if someone has an existing house and they want to add a house in the backyard, that could be called a duplex instead of tearing down the existing structure. This is another example in downtown Springfield in the Washburn Historic District. This is actually a single detached dwelling with an attached and a detached accessory dwelling unit, but this could be an example of what a detached triplex looks like in Eugene. There's also an incentive for smaller housing. And so in the Planning Commission recommendation, if middle housing units are 900 square feet or smaller, they are allotted a lot size reduction as well as an on-site parking reduction. And the idea is to encourage smaller, lower cost units on smaller, lower cost lots. This is a great graphic that we borrowed from our community partners at Better Housing Together that shows where we anticipate this new middle housing supply to be at on the affordability graph, and so, or the affordability spectrum. So the red arrow in the top right shows where the current supply of new housing is, and that's delivered at around 200% of area median income currently. So with the proposed code amendments, we could see the new middle housing coming in at anywhere between 60% to 100% of area median income, which is something we're not seeing being built these days. So even though it is market rate, it is filling that void, stuff that's not being built currently. And then we have another incentive for housing near transit. And so in the Planning Commission recommendation, if new middle housing is within 1/4 of a mile of frequent transit, they are allotted an on-site parking reduction. And the idea behind this is to align with goals to reduce dependence on single occupancy vehicles that are already identified in plans such as the Transportation System Plan. And the last incentive is for income qualified housing. And so this would be a lot size reduction as well as an on-site parking reduction for housing that is reserved for folks making 80% of area median income or below. And this incentive is not included in the minimum standards or the model code. This is something that Eugene identified independently through our public involvement process and through the Planning Commission deliberations. And this is also something that we'd really like to hear the community's input on. We want to know if 80% is the right number. And so if this graphic is borrowed from the recently adopted Housing Implementation Pipeline, which is available at eugene-or.gov/HIP. So just think about that as we go into the public, or as we currently are in the public comment period for the project. And I've been talking for a while, so I'll hand it over to Jeff for hot topics.
Thanks, Sophie. So I'm going to briefly touch on some hot topics that we've seen people asking questions about and making comments on in the public testimony. These hot topics are also discussed at length in the guide as well, so you can look there for these and some more topics included there. So first, I'll jump in and talk about special area zones. So for anybody that's not intimately familiar with Eugene's zoning code, like staff is, or some of our consultants are, or the public, we don't just have typical, residential zones. We also have some what are called special area zones. We refer to them as SAZs. And these SAZs were essentially developed for specific parts of town based on neighborhood feedback and how to essentially control development through development standards that apply only within those special areas. And through this process, the Planning Commission, as well as the public, asked the question of whether or not the middle housing standard should apply just across the board. It's the same for everyone. There's no confusion about what standards do apply. And so what was chosen and directed from the Planning Commission based on some of that public feedback was that, the middle housing code standard should be the same everywhere. So no matter what your special area zone might be, the middle housing development standards will apply across the board, and that's based on what your residential designation is. So that's how we're treating special area zones. That includes some of the special neighborhood considerations as well. That said, we do have a couple special area zones. One is the special historic zone. The other one is the special Blair historic area. These areas, there was a specific carve out within the state law for middle housing that allowed for the exemption of our historic districts from the middle housing standards. So in those specific areas, those development standards will still apply. That said, looking at the Blair special area, for example, that area actually already allows middle housing, so it's not really too much of a concern. But those areas like the East Skinner's Butte neighborhood and others that are in the special historic, those standards will still apply. And so the next one is about covenants, conditions, and restrictions, commonly referred to as CCNRs. Some of you might think of these as rules that apply within an HOA, a homeowners association, or an HOA. And a lot of folks were wondering when these rules were coming about, well, can I record a CCNR or a covenant on my property that says my property can only be developed with a single family home? Essentially using these as a tool to protect and what they would consider to be stopping middle housing development in their neighborhood. And it was written into the state law that after the state law was adopted, you cannot record or put into effect CCNRs that prohibit middle housing. And so if you had a CCNR that was recorded before the adoption of the House bill, so prior to 2019, that said, this property can only ever have a single family home on it, that could be enforced. But if you tried to record that same CCNR today, you wouldn't be able to enforce that, and you would have to allow middle housing in accordance with the local regulations. And then the last one that I'll talk about today is middle housing land divisions. So the primary intent looking at the middle housing code amendments process was to increase options for the development of different housing types within our city. Traditionally it's been either single family homes or apartment buildings. And this is really looking to, the middle housing code amendments is really looking to open the door for other housing types. The state, after they passed that, they recognized that, well, we don't want to just allow more types. We also want to create opportunities for home ownership and find pathways to make that a little bit easier. And so the Senate passed Senate Bill 458, which was the Middle Housing Land Division Bill. And what it did is it actually created a whole new land division process. So, typically if somebody wants to divide their land, they draw a line, it's a vacant piece of property, they develop a house on it, whatever. Well, this is a little bit of a different process where essentially what you do is you have a fourplex, triplex, duplex, or whatever, and you're able to divide the land where each unit can be owned individually. And you actually own the land under your house or whatever that part of the duplex or triplex is. And this is kind of an alternative option to a condo. So a lot of us are familiar with condos as a purchasing opportunity where you buy into, the HOA, and there's kind of a whole rigmarole there. Well, for anybody who's never gone through the condominiumization process, it's really, really cost prohibitive. It's very expensive between the insurance and the legal matters to do so. And so the Middle Housing Land Division offers an alternative to that. And to put it simply, what you really have is you have a parent lot and you have child lots. And Sophie, if you go to the next page, I'll describe that a little bit more in detail. So looking at the two examples at the bottom of the screen, the one on the left is a duplex and the one on the right is a cottage cluster. And these currently exist in Eugene, so I just chose these as quick little examples. And what you're seeing here is the purple line is what we would call the parent lot. And so from that, within that purple line, you have all your traditional development standards. You have your setbacks, you have your lot coverage, you have building height, and you have to meet all of those applicable development standards within the parent lot. What Middle Housing Land Division allows you to do is to come in either before, after, or whenever, and create a whole new lot. You can see that's what I marked out with the red hashed line there. And you could sell off that one portion of the duplex, or you could sell off each individual cottage to a new homeowner. So it really provides you an opportunity to create home ownership in middle housing types where that previously was pretty prohibitive under the condo process. And so the Middle Housing Land Divisions does come with some rules. They're relatively simple and straightforward. That's why they're pretty beneficial compared to our traditional land division processes. The number one thing is that each lot has to have one unit of middle housing on it. The remainder of the lot is essentially a combination of common area and easement areas. So things like pedestrian access, common areas, driveways, parking areas. Each unit has to have its separate utilities, so you have to have all the necessary easements for your utilities as well. All the buildings have to meet the building code, so that's anything from fire separation to building separation to building construction. And then lastly, as I mentioned, the parent lot itself has to meet the applicable development code standards. Now, Eugene chose to make this a little more flexible. The Planning Commission essentially said, hey, let's not, the state only required it to apply to new middle housing developments. And we recommended that this also applied to existing middle housing developments. So if the middle housing development met the standards at the time it was developed, you can also go through this process. And so what is an often thing that's being confused is you'll hear people say that there is no minimum lot area for middle housing developments. And That's true when it comes to the child lots that you're seeing on the screen here. You can really match up that line with the outside edges of a building, for example. But that parent lot, each one of those has to meet those standards. And then when you put one of those lots or one of those pieces of middle housing on an individual lot, it's still one part of a greater whole. So you really only have one unit that's part of a duplex. You have one unit that's part of a triplex. It's no longer, you don't all of a sudden become a single family home that can then be further subdivided. You don't get any additional rights or ability to develop the property beyond what it was designed as. So it's still a fourplex, it's still a duplex. They can just be sold individually. And so with that, I'll say, we've covered kind of what is 135 pages of code amendments here tonight in approximately, 35 minutes. So there is an abundance and a wealth of information that's available. A ton of facts, FAQs, all of our public engagement processes, all the videos from all the planning commission meetings. Pretty much anything you could ever want from this process is on the city website. It's eugene-or.gov/middle housing. I highly recommend you go check out this page if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper into what these code amendments mean and how they can support the development of new housing in Eugene. And the one thing that I would really call out is taking a look at the guide to the Planning Commission recommendation. That's where we're currently at, and it's a really helpful tool to just understand and digest what is a really large package. The other thing I would say is that you're ever looking for the Zoom links, we do post those on this page as well. So with that, the question is, what now? So where are we in this overall process? Obviously, House Bill 2001 passed in 2019. So we're pretty far along the process here. We're doing these information sessions. This is the second of 3. We're continuing to receive written testimony leading up to the City Council public hearing. And so the City Council will be provided any written testimony that's received. At the City Council and their public hearing, it's scheduled for April 18th. And you can provide verbal testimony at the hearing. The testimony pieces are usually limited 2 or 3 minutes apiece. So I highly recommend that if you have detailed comments to make, that you provide that in a written form for the council to take into consideration, and providing that as early as possible to give them even more time to digest that. So, but you can always attend that public hearing. Following the public hearing, the City Council will deliberate and discuss the proposal. And then finally, they will take action prior to June 30th of this year. So lastly, I just talked about providing written testimony. If you're going to be providing written testimony, you can email mayor and city council, that's fine, but I always recommend sending it to middlehousingtestimony@eugene-or.gov. That way staff is tracking and monitoring that email, and we can make sure that all that material is batched and provided to our city council for their public hearing. And so again, I can't stress this enough, looking at the guide to the Planning Commission recommendation. That's honestly where I go a lot of times to double check just where I'm at in terms of whether we are allowing or encouraging or incentivizing middle housing throughout this process. And the project page, if you would like to, you can sign up for emails about this project. You can do that by there's a tiny URL on the page right now. You can also, a link to that's also available on the project page itself. And finally, you can always reach out to Sophie. She's happy to field your emails. And so with that, we will open it up for, I see we have a few questions in the chat here. And I'm going to be moderating our questions tonight. So I'm going to take a second here to take a look at these, and then I'll basically be bouncing questions between those of us that presented, or potentially even Commissioner Fragala if it's directed towards the commission. So our first question that I see in the chat is, how do we find out if there's a CCNR in my neighborhood area? So CCNRs are recorded typically as part of a land division or potentially just on a piece of private property. So checking with the title company is the best way to find covenants, conditions, and restrictions that are applied to a property. The city does not have a database. The work that it would require to essentially gather that many documents going back in time would be cost prohibitive. And so there are some neighborhood groups that have worked to collect those and kind of collate them into one pile, but it's not something that the city enforces. Just as a reminder, CCNRs are private documents, so the city is not party to them. And so we can't actually enforce them. And I want to thank David, who provided an answer to that one as well. So next question is, oh, so did Terry. Sorry, I'm catching up, everybody. Karen has 2 questions. The fourplex example that you showed, if that's the max envelope allowed by the land use code with the parking reduction, does that mean that fourplex is either affordable housing or near frequent transit? How much parking would a typical fourplex be required to include? Sophie, do you want to jump on that one, or at least part of it?
Yeah, so if a fourplex, if the planning commission's recommendations are adopted as is, and that fourplex is built on that lot, that would mean that there are either small units, which means they're less than 900 square feet in size, and or units that are available for a fixed income at 80% AMI, area median income or less, and or the fourplex is located within 1/4 of a mile of frequent transit. The second part of that question is how much park, do you want to add on to that, Jeff?
Oh, I just wanted to add, so it's a half mile within transit for our frequent transit areas, or a half mile from our MX corridors.
Thank you for correcting me there. I think I said 1/4 mile in the presentation, so just noting that that was incorrect, and it's a half mile. You would think we would not get anything wrong at this point when we've been presenting this so much. And then the second part of that question is how much parking would a typical fourplex be required to include? So if we follow the minimum standards, for the maximum amount of parking that we could require is 4 on-site parking spaces per fourplex. Currently, the Planning Commission's recommendation proposes to allow on-street parking credits, which is something that's already in the code. So if there's adequate on-street parking, you could use some of those spaces in place of on-site parking, and Jeff could always talk more about that if you have more specific questions. However, I did say that the maximum we could allow is 4 spaces, and so the minimum standards parking allowances are directly tied to lot sizes. And so because the Planning Commission's recommendation proposes smaller lot sizes than the maximum allowed by the minimum standards, if you're following me here, there's a lot of minimum and maximum. Then in some cases, the maximum amount of required spaces could be less than 4. It could be 3 or 2. And those numbers are all in the guide, or I could pop it up on the shared screen real quick. Or put it in writing, because I don't know how clear my verbal comment was.
And Karen did note that, asked a question about the area of asphalt or hard surface that's typically required with parking. A parking space is usually 8 by 17, but you got to have the driveway and everything else. So on a typical lot where you have that much parking, you're looking at anywhere from a minimum of likely 500 square feet to 2,000 square feet of impervious surface for those parking areas. Obviously, that depends on site design and a lot of factors, but you can kind of consider that a typical scenario. The second question that Karen asked was, how does that fourplex example meet the stormwater code? And I can take that one because I answer this question on a pretty regular basis. The Middle Housing Code changes do not propose any changes to the stormwater regulations. So whatever stormwater regulations currently apply, they will also have to demonstrate that they meet that. And so there's kind of 2 primary ways that people typically meet the stormwater standards, and that's either by discharging to the public system, and if they do that, they have to prove that there's enough capacity to do so, or they can contain it on site. So those folks that you see with rain gardens or dry wells and other types of mitigation tools like that, you can also detain stormwater on site. It's basically to make sure that by adding a structure onto the site, you're not increasing the stormwater impacts on properties near you. That's kind of the rule to think about it. So we've got another question here that says, are there any plans on putting middle housing high density near bicycle paths? So who wants to take that one? Anybody want to raise their hand? Terry.
I'll give it a shot because this was discussed by transportation planning staff when we were discussing what sort of options there were for incentivizing or encouraging middle housing in different parts of the city. So ultimately, the Planning Commission's recommendation settled on frequent transit lines, which is a map that was provided to us by Lane Transit District, which aligns with other visionary documents we have for encouraging compact development along our major streets in Eugene. However, this was suggested and discussed at a certain point in time. So I just wanted to point that out. I guess also it would be helpful to probably say that middle housing is proposed to be implemented equally across the city. And so it's not an incentive to do higher density narrow bike path, but bike paths crisscross the city, and the code would apply to all areas of the city equally. So it would increase access to bicycle facilities in that sense.
Yeah, I totally agree, Terry. Middle housing does allow more units on land, so it is by nature a higher density thing, but I just want to be cautious about using the term high density because we do have a high density zone, and that includes, the areas near the university where you're seeing 120-foot towers going up, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about middle housing, which is compatible kind of across the board in our residential areas. That's it. And I don't see any other questions pending in the chat currently. Oh, sorry, David, would you like to ask a question live?
So, given the amount of open space in the city, do you anticipate that most of this middle income housing will actually be built by owners of parent lots versus developers buying a piece of property and building, 6 cottages? I mean, do you have any sense of who's going to take advantage of this?
Terry, do you want to talk a little bit about our
Yeah.
economic impact research and things like that?
Absolutely. That's a great question, and one that we've gotten throughout the process. I have a couple of comments to make about it. First, if you scroll back in the chat, I put a couple of links into our economic feasibility analysis and another memo about the impacts of different code options on housing affordability. And so I'll just summarize kind of one of the findings of the first document, the economic feasibility analysis, was that middle housing, once allowed by Eugene code, is anticipated to follow already existing trends for infill. So where you see a duplex popping up here or there, or some row houses, that is anticipated to continue just at a slightly higher number of units per lot. So again, middle housing is intended to be house scale. But right now we don't have existing code to count on to know really what's going to happen after it's put in place. So we had our consultants do some estimating based on what they know of the housing market in Eugene, and that's in those 2 documents that I linked to. And the other comment that I have is that the laws around middle housing were updated in Portland before the passage of House Bill 2001. And so we're starting to see, or our consultants are, who are tracking this, some evidence of what kind of infill is starting to happen in the Portland metro region. Not that it'll be the same here, but there's starting to be some evidence that where middle housing is allowed, it starts to pop up here and there. And that's really, it's not a scientific answer, but it's not like there was a flood of applications or a concentration in one part of the city. It's more of an incremental kind of here and there popping up gradually kind of phenomenon that's being seen in Portland. So it's a really good question and something that we're hearing a lot of questions about. And one final comment is that as we were asking our consultants to look at what we could do within our code to encourage different kinds of middle housing, they tested different code sections, like what if we increase building height a little bit? What if we allowed a little bit more lot coverage? What if we reduced parking? And those are really the only ways within a land use code to kind of change the dial on whether a building project is feasible or not. So that's where those recommendations came from, as they were talked about at the Planning Commission, was the economic feasibility analysis.
Thanks, Terry. And I'll just, I'll tack on one other final piece because it's something that I'm always thinking about, which is the option that the Planning Commission's recommendation finally went with, which was to allow detached plexes. So on those lots that, you could, so for a typical homeowner, it doesn't make economic or logical sense to tear down the home that you're living in and to develop a fourplex or a triplex or whatever have you. But you might have a single home on a rather large lot. Maybe you don't have the know-how or processing to divide your land or go through that thing. But allowing the detached plexes would allow a landowner or a homeowner to go in and actually just throw another house on the back of their lot or next to their existing house and avoid that situation of having to either tear down their existing home or engineer an attached structure. And so I think that's one of the incentives that's really crucial to not only kind of allowing individual homeowners to kind of really engage in the middle housing process, but also to mitigate and the displacement of existing homes. So I think that's one of the incentives that I think is really important in this process. And that I think the Planning Commission was really diligent and really thoughtful in thinking about how that could really benefit the community.
Jeff, I see a follow-up question from Karen, and she's asking about the stormwater code. And so I want to know, can you just walk us through, like, okay, somebody has a 4,500 square foot lot currently, and they're allowed to build a house on it, but what else applies to development other than land use code regulations? How would something like stormwater requirements play into the development of a house? And I guess the reason why I ask about single detached dwellings is because the single detached dwellings will have the same stormwater requirements applied to them as middle housing, right?
Yeah, that's totally true. So we have a whole series of existing development standards that they apply to any development that occurs throughout Eugene. And our land use code covers anything from whether or not you have to underground utilities to stormwater to landscape standards in certain areas and things like that. So in this instance, when we're thinking about stormwater, that example where we showed a structure that pretty much took the entire building envelope on a lot, that would only be feasible in a scenario where you could discharge stormwater to a public system, because otherwise you'd have to find room somewhere for a rain garden or some sort of stormwater detention. And so it's really going to be rare that you're going to see someone take up an entire lot, because most often discharging to a public system is a rather costly endeavor. And so you see a lot of people doing the on-site mitigation. And to that same point, you can kind of relate that to parking, which, one of the concerns is, maintaining open space and natural areas. And by reducing the number of parking spaces that are required on a lot, presents just more opportunity to have that area not covered by asphalt and have that area covered by landscaping, vegetation, outdoor space for people who actually live there. Those types of things would be much better than just having it be a parking space. So just a little off topic there, but yeah, so there's a ton of development regulations that we are not proposing to change that will apply to all of these scenarios. So, and I did see that we did get another question here, and it's would an additional house, ADU, for example, tie in directly to the sewer? So typically speaking, any new dwelling is required to have a sewer connection. When you have multiple dwellings on a lot, you are, in certain cases, permitted to have a situation where several connections on a lot will come together, and then you have one point of access to the main, whatever the main line is for the city wastewater system. That's a kind of a case-by-case scenario. That's going to depend on a number of different factors, but each unit will be required to have its own wastewater line coming off of a unit. And here I'm talking about middle housing. ADUs do operate a little bit differently in the way that they're developed. And just as a reminder, ADUs don't actually fall under the jurisdiction of middle housing. An ADU is simply defined as an accessory dwelling that is accessory to a single family home. So a duplex, triplex, fourplex, they do not get the benefit of also having an ADU on their property through these code changes. So I hope I answered that question about the sewer connections effectively. Again, that's an existing standard. We're not proposing any changes to the requirement for connections to wastewater. One of the only things that we are changing in regards to utilities is that for those examples where you have above ground utilities, those would be things like telecommunication lines or electrical. Typically you always have to underground your utilities, and that's kind of a bar none rule. Like, you just always have to underground it, with the goal of eventually having all of our electrical system underground. That said, there are specific exemptions to allow infill to happen because undergrounding is really, really costly. And so we did add middle housing infill to the list of things where you don't have to underground your utilities. So if you have a telephone pole next to your property, you can connect to that. But if you had to install a new telephone pole and add more above ground utilities, you wouldn't get that exemption.
Jeff, did you notice that Mackenzie has her hand raised?
Oh, I didn't. Oh my gosh, I've been paying attention to the chat. I will take a break and I will let Mackenzie ask her question, and then I'll jump back into the next question. So Mackenzie, you can go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thank you. I have a slightly odd or detailed question. I was curious how these code changes, once implemented, how they'd impact a parcel that already has a vested land use approval. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you hypothetically had an existing PUD approval for multiple phases, and one of those phases has yet to have a conceptual or detailed development plan submitted. Could that future phase utilize this once adopted middle housing code, or are our hands tied to the old PUD approval as vested code?
Thanks, Mackenzie, and thanks, Commissioner Fragler, for pointing out that raised hand. I was totally missing that. That is a very good question and a very nuanced question. For those of you, I'm going to try to break it down before I go into answering it. But essentially what Mackenzie is getting at is that throughout the city, people go through processes like subdivisions or planned unit developments where they will have a very specific development pattern that is reviewed, commented on by the public, and approved by a decision maker. And each case is going to be somewhat different because each approval is different. In certain cases, we have planned unit developments where it literally says, here's a house, here's a lot, this is what that house is relatively going to look like. And in those cases, you're pretty much vested with the development type that was there. In other examples, you might have a PUD that just says, hey, we're creating 50 residential lots. Well, those residential lots, now, if it wasn't specifically called out how many units were going to be on there or anything like that, you would be able to take advantage of those new middle housing rules that are going to be in effect moving forward, because it kind of assumed development in a scale that was consistent with the zoning. So the simple answer and the unfortunate answer in this case is that it really depends. It's going to depend. Each PUD, each land use approval is very different, and the degree at which they've been considered is also different. So if you have specific cases in mind, I highly recommend you reach out to staff. I'd be happy to take a look at those and work through any questions regarding specific ones. But that's a great question, and really important for thinking about how those existing land use approvals will be affected.
That's wonderful. I realize I asked a very difficult question. I didn't expect to get a straight answer, no offense. I will definitely reach out to staff though with more specifics on a case file.
Yep, that's perfect. No, we've had that question from a few people, so I appreciate you bringing it up today.
Oh, I'm sure. And to your point, it is nuanced. Thank you.
All right, so Tim B has asked, and Sophie, please let me know if I miss anything because I'm trying to do it. So an ADU would not be considered a cottage cluster of 2 units. Sophie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so as Jeff mentioned already, accessory dwelling units, also ADUs, are not covered under the middle housing code amendments. They went through their own process. But they do look similar to cottage clusters because ADUs are typically 800 square feet or smaller, and cottage clusters are defined as 900 square feet or smaller. The main difference between them is that ADUs are an accessory to a primary dwelling, a primary single detached dwelling or single family home, as we sometimes refer to them. Cottage clusters are their own primary dwellings. And there's specific design standards that apply to them. So the code or the minimum standards and the proposed code define cottage clusters as at least, I want to say 4, but I want to make sure I'm getting it right, at least 4 small dwellings, so 900 square feet or less. There is an average size, I think, that allows an average size of 1,000 square feet, but typically we're going to see them at 900 square feet or less, around a common open space. And so these clusters would all be on one lot. There would be no primary dwelling that they're accessory to. And we do have some existing examples. Just throw a follow-up question in the chat if you'd like to see me show any of those via screen share. Then it looks like there's another question. I don't know if we could have a very specific like planning department response to this question, but I like it. It's what would the most positive outcome of all this, or what would be the most positive outcome of all this planning? That comes from Charlotte. And that was actually one of the first questions that we asked all of our roundtable groups is what's the best outcome of this project and what's the worst outcome of this project? And through all of those answers that we got from our various groups, we compiled the guiding values and principles. And so we heard that there would be more, or we heard from the community that the best outcome would be more housing of all shapes and sizes that is available at different income levels, opportunities for home ownership. We heard that we wanted to be environmentally friendly and consider the climate, reduce dependence on cars. We also heard that a positive outcome from all of this planning was continuing to involve underheard voices in our planning processes. So I can link to those guiding values and principles in some of the meeting summaries if you'd like. I definitely have some personal positive outcomes that I'd like to see, but just really want to share what we heard from the community and what we're hoping that the Planning Commission recommendations achieve. They all root back to those guiding values and principles that all root back to that first question of what would a positive outcome be of all of this? Do you have anything to add to that, Terry or Jeff or Commissioner Fragola?
I think one of the things that we heard early on in those initial guiding values was that the community wanted middle housing distributed equitably across all neighborhoods of the city. Otherwise, I think you really got most of them.
I was just waiting to see if there were more questions. I would add one tiny thing to that answer, and that is that the project goals that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation were referred to again by the Planning Commission in their recommendation. So the letter that's at the beginning of the guide to the Planning Commission recommendation references the project goals and recommends that the council direct staff to evaluate whether those project goals are being met over time. So in addition to monitoring and tracking the numbers, are the incentives being used? Are we seeing middle housing getting built? You know, all the quantifiable things. The Planning Commission was really hoping that we would take a look at the more qualitative project goals, and those included furthering housing equity and affordability, diversity and availability, and then implementing the House bill successfully, which means surviving land use appeals.
Thank you, Commissioner Fragala and Terry. While we wait for any additional questions to come in, I'll just plug that we have one more of these information sessions. It's next Thursday at 7 p.m. And it will be a different Zoom link, but that Zoom link will be available on the project webpage. The first middle housing information session was recorded. That was last week. This one's recorded. All of the recordings will be available on the webpage. If you want to come back and revisit us, you are totally welcome to. We will have the exact same presentation. So I don't know how interesting it will be, but please spread the word to your community. We'd love to hear just any feedback you have as staff. We'd also just really love to receive as much public testimony as we can, both written and the day of the public hearing, April 18th. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat, but it's smcginley@eugene-or.gov. And if I'm not the right person, odds are I know the right person to forward it to, so we can field all your questions, including site-specific questions if you currently have those.
Excellent. At this time, I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So with
All
that,
right. Well, thank you everyone for coming.
cool. Yeah. Thanks everyone. Great questions tonight. Really appreciate them.